I pulled over on the shoulder of I-10 West at 2:42 in the morning, and for a long moment I just sat there with my engine running and my spotlight aimed at the center lane, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. They weren't. Right there in the middle of the highway, perfectly upright, perfectly centered between the white lines like someone had set it down with a level, was a piece of luggage. A child's suitcase. Pale blue, hard shell, the kind with a little cartoon airplane printed on the side that was half peeled off from use. No car pulled to the side. No skid marks. No glass. No debris. No sign that anything had ever gone wrong. Just the suitcase, sitting there in the dark like it was waiting for a flight. I got out. The night was cold the way West Texas gets cold in October. Not dramatic, just mean. Dry and sharp and indifferent. My boots crunched on the asphalt as I walked up to it, and I remember looking both directions down that highway before I touched anything. A habit you develop so deep it stops feeling like a habit. Nothing. Not a single set of headlights in either direction. Just the sound of the wind coming off the scrubland and my own breathing. I crouched down and unlatched it. Later, when I tried to describe what I found inside to my sergeant, I kept stopping myself because the details were so specific and so ordinary that they made the whole thing worse. There was a pair of boys' sneakers, white with a blue stripe, size 3, tied together at the laces. A folded-up drawing of a house done in crayon, the kind every kid draws, with a triangle roof and a sun in the corner and a dog that looked more like a loaf of bread. A dinosaur figurine, a triceratops, I remember, because my own boy had one just like it on his dresser at home. 2 pairs of socks rolled into balls. A toothbrush still in its packaging. And underneath all of it, a small photograph. Not in a frame, just loose. Of a boy around 7 years old, squinting into the sun, holding up a fish he'd clearly just caught, proud as anything. No name anywhere. Not on the suitcase. Not written inside the sneakers the way mothers sometimes do. Nothing. I stood back up slowly and looked down that highway again in both directions, and I had a feeling I still don't have a word for. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more like the sensation of a question being asked in a language you almost speak. Like the road was telling me something and I was one vocabulary word short of understanding it. I called it in. Ran the plates of every vehicle we'd logged in the last 4 hours on that stretch. Contacted the nearest county sheriff. Filed a found property report. Did everything you're supposed to do. Nobody ever called about a blue suitcase. No missing child report matched the timing, the location, the description. I requested follow-ups at 30 days and 60 days and 90 days, and each time the answer came back the same, nothing. No match. No claim. No explanation. The suitcase went into an evidence storage facility in San Antonio, and as far as I know it's still sitting in some labeled bin in a back room somewhere, that little half-peeled airplane on the side of it, waiting. There's a moment in this job, and you only understand it after you've been doing it long enough, where you stop expecting every call to resolve. You learn to hold things open. You learn that some questions don't get answered in the same shift, or the same year, or maybe ever. Most of the time, that's fine. Most of the time, you can set it down. But this one I couldn't set down. I don't fully understand why. I've worked fatal accidents. I've delivered death notifications. I've pulled people out of overturned vehicles on rain-slick highways at 3 in the morning and held their hands while we waited for the ambulance to come screaming up the road. I've seen things that were objectively worse than a suitcase sitting on a highway, and yet this one followed me home. Maybe it was the photograph, the boy holding up the fish, the way he was squinting into the sun like the whole world was just that moment, just that catch, just whatever was making him grin like that. I kept thinking about who took that picture. I kept thinking about how that photograph ended up in a suitcase that ended up in the center lane of a West Texas highway at 2:40 in the morning with no explanation attached to it. I took a Polaroid of the scene before I bagged the evidence. Standard procedure. But I never turned that Polaroid in. I don't know why, it wasn't like me to do that. I put it in my shirt pocket and I drove the rest of my shift, and when I got home that morning I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I looked at that photograph of an empty highway with a little blue suitcase in the center of it until the sun came up through the window. And then I folded it in half and I put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 30 years. Not as a reminder of anything specific. Not as a wound. More like, and this is going to sound strange, more like a responsibility. Like as long as I had it, I was still the person who found it. Like if I threw it away, nobody would be. My wife found it once, maybe 10 years in, when she was looking for a receipt. She unfolded it and looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at me and she didn't ask a single question. She just refolded it and put it back and went back to what she was doing. That's how you know someone understands you. People ask me sometimes what I think happened, and I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count. Every version, every scenario, every logical explanation. A custody situation gone sideways. A vehicle breakdown and a panicked parent who grabbed the child and left everything else. A bag thrown from a moving car during a fight. An accident that somehow left no trace. I've run through all of it. None of it sits flat. Every explanation leaves a corner sticking up. The thing about working a highway for that many years is that you start to understand roads the way sailors understand water. A highway is not just a piece of infrastructure. It's a place where people are between things, between where they were and where they're going, between one version of their life and another, between a decision made and a decision not yet made. People do things on highways they would never do anywhere else. They fall apart on highways. They get brave on highways. They disappear on highways. Most of the time there's a report. Most of the time there's a trail. Sometimes there's just a suitcase in the center lane at 2:42 in the morning, packed like someone expected a child to need it again, sitting upright on the cold asphalt of I-10 West like it had always been there and always would be. I retired in 2015, turned in my badge on a Thursday afternoon, drove home in my personal vehicle for the first time in years, and sat in my driveway for about 10 minutes before going inside. The Polaroid came out of my wallet that night and went into a box I keep on the top shelf of my closet. The box with my badge and my first unit patch and a few other things I'm not ready to throw away and not sure how to keep. But I still think about that stretch of I-10. I still think about the boy in the photograph with the fish. He'd be in his late 30s now, early 40s maybe. He could be anybody. He could be driving that same highway right now, windows down, radio up, no idea that somewhere in a storage facility in San Antonio there's a blue suitcase with a drawing he made as a kid and a dinosaur figurine and a toothbrush still in its packaging. Or maybe he knows exactly where that suitcase ended up. Maybe that night is something he carries too, in whatever way a child carries the nights that adults never explain to them. I hope he's all right. I genuinely, truly hope that kid is all right. That's the whole story. That's all there is. A suitcase on an empty highway, a photograph of a boy in the sun, and 30 years of a question that never stopped being a question. Some things you don't solve. You just carry them, and you keep driving.
I've thought about telling this story for a long time. Not because I think it'll change anything or because I expect anyone to find an answer that 2 years of looking hasn't produced. I think I just need somewhere to put it, because carrying it alone gets heavy in a way I didn't expect when I was 23 years old working the overnight shift at a truck stop in Iowa. I work at the Pilot Travel Center on US 30 just east of Ames. Night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I've been doing it since I was 19, which I know sounds like the kind of job you take temporarily and then life just keeps you in, and honestly that's exactly what happened. The hours suit me. I'm a night person. The overnight crowd at a truck stop is its own world. Quieter than you'd think, more polite than people expect, a lot of men and women who are tired in a specific way that road miles produce, who just want coffee and something to eat and to be treated like a regular human being for 5 minutes before they get back in a cab. I like that crowd. I always have. He came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday in April. I remember the time because I just finished restocking the cooler section and I looked up at the clock when the door chimed. Older guy, I'd put him at maybe 60, 62. Big through the shoulders, the kind of build that used to be strong and was still solid. White hair cut short. He was wearing a gray Carhartt jacket that had seen better days and work boots that had seen even worse ones. He walked the way long-haul drivers walk after a full day behind the wheel. A little stiff, a little deliberate, like his body was reminding him it had been sitting in one position for too many hours. He went to the coffee station first. I watched him out of habit. You watch people on overnight, not in a suspicious way, just because there's not much else to watch and it's part of the job to be aware of who's in the store. He took his time with the coffee, poured it black, no cream, no sugar, replaced the lid carefully. Then he walked the snack aisle once without picking anything up. Then he came to the register. He put the coffee on the counter and then he looked at the scratch ticket display behind me. The one we keep at eye level for exactly this reason. He said, "Go ahead and give me one of those $5 ones." The crossword. I pulled one down and rang it up. He paid cash. A 20, waited for his change, folded it into his jacket pocket without counting it. The kind of casual trust that tells you a person is comfortable with small transactions. He took the scratch ticket and a quarter from the little dish we keep on the counter for that purpose, and he scratched it right there, leaning on the counter with one elbow. He didn't win. $2 on the last row, not enough to cash out. He looked at it for a second with the expression people get. Not disappointed exactly, more like confirming what they already expected, and then he smiled. Small smile, more to himself than to me. He said, "Story of my life." And he put the ticket in his jacket pocket. I said something like, "Better luck next time." He said, "Yeah, maybe." He picked up his coffee and he said, "You have a good rest of your night." And I said, "You drive safe." And he walked out the door. That was it. 45 seconds, maybe a minute. The entire interaction was completely ordinary in every way. I don't know why I remember it so clearly. I've tried to figure that out and I can't. I serve 300 people a week on that shift. I don't remember most of them past the end of the transaction. But him I remember. The gray jacket and the scratch ticket and the small smile when he lost. The way he said, "Story of my life." Something about it just stayed. 11 miles west on US 30, at 3:22 a.m., a westbound trucker called 911 to report a truck pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights on. The caller said it had been sitting there for about 20 minutes as he passed, and there was no indication of a breakdown. No flat visible, no smoke, nothing. He said it just looked parked. Story County Sheriff's deputies responded. They found a blue Freightliner Cascadia. Clean pull onto the shoulder. Hazard lights running. Cab dark. They approached the driver's side door and knocked. No response. They tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside the cab, his phone sitting in the dash mount. His wallet in the cup holder. His keys in the ignition turned to accessory power, which is why the hazards were running. His coffee from my register was in the second cup holder, lid still on. It was still warm when the deputies touched it. On the dash, held under the corner of his phone so it wouldn't slide, was the scratch ticket. The crossword one, $5, the one he'd lost on at my counter 35 minutes earlier. He was gone. The deputies searched the shoulder and the adjacent area with flashlights. US 30 at that location runs through flat agricultural land, corn and soybean fields, mostly with drainage ditches running alongside. Wide open. Nowhere to go that you couldn't be seen going. No evidence he'd gone into the ditch, no footprints in the soft ground at the shoulder edge. Nothing. He was simply not in the truck, and there was no visible indication of where he had gone or why. A deputy ran his plates and got his name and his company's dispatch number. His company had him scheduled for a delivery in Denison the next morning. He hadn't missed any check-ins. The stop at my pilot had been a routine fuel and rest break, logged properly, and his next required check-in wasn't until 6 a.m. Nobody had known anything was wrong until that 911 call. His family was contacted. His daughter drove up from Des Moines. I know this because a Story County detective came to talk to me 2 days later, after they'd pulled our security footage and identified me as the last person to have a documented interaction with him. I told them everything I just told you. The detective showed me a photograph to confirm it was the same man I'd served. It was. The detective asked me if he'd seemed distressed. I said no. He asked if he'd said anything unusual. I said no. He asked if anyone else had been in the store at the same time who seemed to be paying attention to him. I thought about it carefully because I wanted to be useful. There had been 2 other people in the store. A young woman buying energy drinks who left before he came to the register, and a man in a booth eating a sandwich who I was pretty sure was a local because I'd seen him before, not a driver. Neither of them had seemed to pay any attention to the man in the gray jacket. I asked the detective if they'd found anything in the fields along that stretch of road. He said they'd done a thorough search. He said they'd brought an AK-9 unit. He said the dog had tracked a scent from the truck to the shoulder edge and then lost it, which the handler had said was unusual on open ground like that. the kind of terrain where scent normally carries well. He said they hadn't found anything. I've thought about that scratch ticket more than anything else. Not because it's the strangest detail, the warm coffee and the missing keys are stranger in certain ways, but because of how personal it is. He'd held it in his hand. He'd lost on it and made a small joke and put it in his pocket. And then whatever happened in those 35 minutes between my counter and mile marker, wherever it was, he'd taken it out of his pocket and left it on the dash under his phone, like he was saving it or like he wanted someone to find it, or like he'd set it down without thinking because his mind was somewhere else entirely. The story of my life, he'd said. I've turned that phrase over and over. At 2:47 a.m. in a pilot travel center in Iowa, to a cashier he'd never met and would never see again, making a small joke about a scratch ticket. You say things like that 100 times in your life without meaning anything by them. You say them and you walk out the door and you get back in your truck and you keep driving. Except he didn't keep driving. He stopped 11 miles down the road and he left his phone and his wallet and his keys and his coffee and the scratch ticket on the dash, and he went somewhere that a sheriff's department and a K-9 unit and his family and whatever's left of an open missing persons case has never been able to follow. I still work the same shift at the same pilot. Different register now, they renovated the front end last year. But same hours, same counter, same scratch ticket display behind me. Drivers come in at 3 a.m. and buy coffee and lose on scratch tickets and say, "Story of my life," and walk out the door and I watch them go. Every single time, I watch them all the way to their trucks now. I watch until I see the headlights come on. I watch until they pull back out onto US 30. I watch until I can't see them anymore. It's the least I can do. I know it's not enough. I know it doesn't change anything. But it's what I have, and I do it every night, and I think I'll keep doing it for a long time.
Nobody tells you what to say. That's the thing they leave out of the training. You go through the academy, you do your ride-alongs, you learn the protocols and the radio codes and the correct way to approach a vehicle and the correct way to file a report and the correct angle to park your unit on a traffic stop so that if someone runs you over, the car hits the cruiser first and not you. They teach you all of it. They teach you so much that by the time you pin on that badge for the first time, you feel like you've been handed an instruction manual for every situation a Texas highway can throw at you. And then at 3:20 in the morning on a Wednesday in June, you pull up to an overpass on I-35 near Georgetown, and there's a 16-year-old boy sitting on the outside of the railing with his legs dangling over the edge, and every single page of that manual goes blank. I'd gotten the call about 8 minutes before I arrived. Possible jumper, overpass at exit 208, no other units close. I drove with my lights off for the last quarter mile. That's something an older trooper had told me once, that the lights can startle someone in that situation, that the last thing you want is to announce yourself like an emergency when what you're trying to create is the opposite of an emergency. I parked about 40 yards back and I got out quietly and I walked toward that overpass in the dark with the highway below me and the humid June air sitting on everything like a wet blanket, and I could see him before I reached him. Just his silhouette, sitting there, this thin kid in a gray t-shirt with his back to me and his feet hanging out over nothing. I stopped about 15 feet away. Here is what the manual says to do. Identify yourself. Speak calmly. Establish rapport. Do not make sudden movements. Do not issue commands. Keep them talking. Here is what came out of my mouth. Absolutely nothing. I stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds and I could not find a single word. Not because I was scared or not only because of that, but because everything I could think of to say sounded wrong. Sounded like a line. It sounded like something from a training video and I kept thinking, this kid is 16 years old and he is sitting on the wrong side of a highway overpass railing at 3 in the morning and he knows exactly what a line sounds like. He's heard lines his whole life probably. The last thing he needs is another one. So I did something that was not in any manual I'd ever read. I sat down on the concrete beside the railing. Not next to him, I wasn't close enough to touch him, I want to be clear about that, because there are physical reasons you maintain distance in that situation that have nothing to do with emotion. But I sat down on the pavement maybe 8 feet to his left, cross-legged like I was settling in, and I put my hands in my lap where he could see them, and I looked out at the same darkness he was looking at. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. Below us, a single set of headlights moved through the underpass and disappeared. The highway makes a particular sound at that hour. Not busy, not silent, just this occasional low rush of movement that somehow makes the quiet between cars feel deeper. We sat in that for a while. Then I heard him shift slightly, and I knew without looking that he'd turned his head a fraction toward me. I said, "I failed this job twice before they let me have it. I don't know why that's what came out. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't rehearsed it. It was just the thing that was true and that felt, in that specific moment on that specific overpass, like the right kind of true." He didn't respond right away. Maybe 15 seconds passed. Then he said, "The trooper exam?" I said yes, twice. Same section both times, the written portion, a part on traffic law that I kept getting wrong because I'd convinced myself I understood it when I didn't. Second time I failed it, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the testing center for about an hour. I told him I called my mother from that parking lot and cried, which was true, and which I had never told another living soul before that moment. He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. I kept going. Not with a strategy, not building toward anything I'd been trained to build toward, just talking. I told him about the first time I'd driven a patrol unit alone at night and gotten so turned around on a rural FM road that I'd had to call dispatch and basically admit I was lost, which is not a great look for someone whose entire job is knowing where things are. I told him that the first accident scene I worked, I went back to my unit afterward and sat there for 20 minutes before I could write the report. I told him these things not as a technique, but because sitting next to this boy in the dark at 3 in the morning on a concrete overpass, I felt, for reasons I still don't entirely understand, that the most useful thing I had to offer him was evidence that a person could be failing at something and still be sitting upright. At some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when, he said, "Everyone thinks I'm fine." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm really not." I said, "I know. That's why I'm sitting here." Another car moved through the underpass below us. The sound came and went. Then he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "Does it get less loud?" And I knew exactly what he meant without asking him to explain it, the way you sometimes know things in the middle of the night that you wouldn't be able to explain in the daylight. I said, "Yes, not all at once, not on any schedule, but yes." He sat there for another moment, and then he laughed, came out of nowhere. A Rayal laugh, short, almost surprised, like it caught him off guard as much as it caught me. And I looked at him and he was shaking his head slightly, and he said, "You really got lost?" I said, "Completely and totally lost. On a road I'd driven 100 times. He laughed again, quieter this time. And I kept my face completely still when this happened because I didn't want to do anything that would interrupt the physics of the moment. He turned around. He swung his legs back over the railing. He sat on the correct side of it, on the concrete, and he pulled his knees up to his chest and he looked at the highway below and he said, "Okay, just that. Okay." I didn't move fast. I didn't make it a moment. I just slowly stood up and I said we should probably get off the overpass before someone else came through and panicked. And he nodded and stood up and we walked back to my unit and I wrapped a foil emergency blanket around his shoulders, not because he was in physical shock, but because it was something to do with my hands while I called for a welfare transport. I never filed it the way it actually happened. The report says I made contact with a juvenile in distress, employed verbal de-escalation techniques, and secured safe transport to appropriate services. Every word of that is technically accurate. None of it describes sitting cross-legged on a highway overpass in the dark, telling a 16-year-old about the time I cried in a parking lot. My supervisor never knew. It wasn't by the book, and I knew it, and I'd make the same choice again without hesitating. The first Christmas card came about 6 months later. Just a card, plain, with my unit number on the envelope. He'd looked it up somehow, which told me something about him. Inside it just said, "Still here. Still loud sometimes. But here." I've gotten one every year since. I don't display them. I keep them in the same place I keep the things that matter to me. A specific drawer in my desk at home, the one I have to pull a little harder than the others because it sticks in humid weather. The cards are in there with a photograph of my first patrol unit and a note my mother wrote me the day I finally passed the exam on my 3rd try. I've never written back, partly because I don't know if I should, professionally speaking. Partly because I think the cards aren't really for me. I think they're for him. I think the act of sending them is part of something he's doing for himself, marking time, confirming the same thing every year. Still here. I understand that impulse completely. Some years the most important thing you can say is just that. Not that things are good, not that things are easy, not that the noise has stopped entirely. Just that you're still on the right side of the railing. that you sat down when it mattered in whatever form sitting down takes for you, and that someone sat down next to you and neither of you said anything useful for a while, and then something shifted that you can't fully explain and you turned around. You turned around and you walked back. That's the whole job sometimes. Not the manual, not the protocol, not the correct angle of your patrol unit or the proper radio code for the situation. Just sitting down in the dark next to someone and telling them the true thing. The most useless, embarrassing, unprofessional, human true thing you have. And hoping that's enough. I want to be clear about something before I tell the story. I have seen things in 31 years of law enforcement that would rearrange the furniture in a normal person's mind permanently. I have worked fatals. I have knocked on doors at 2 in the morning with information nobody wants to receive. I have stood in summer heat on blacktop that was soft enough to leave boot prints and done things that the job requires you to do and that you don't discuss at dinner tables. I say all of this so that when I tell you that the strangest night of my entire career involved a man in a tuxedo and 40 head of cattle on a moonlit highway outside of Uvalde, you understand that I am not a person who uses the word strangest lightly. It was a Tuesday in June of 1994. Full moon, and I mean full, the kind of full moon you only get in South Texas where the sky is wide enough to actually use it, where there's nothing tall enough to interrupt it and the light comes down flat and silver on everything and you can read a newspaper by it if you were inclined to read newspapers at 2 in the morning on US 83, which I was not. I was running a routine patrol, which on that stretch of highway meant a lot of nothing interrupted occasionally by a little bit of nothing, and I was fine with that. I had a thermos of coffee that my wife had made before she went to bed, which was better coffee than any gas station between San Antonio and the Mexican border, and I had a radio playing something low, and I had 40 miles of empty highway ahead of me, and life was simple. Then I came around a long, gentle curve north of Uvalde, and my headlights showed me something that caused me to take my foot off the accelerator entirely and simply coast for a moment while my brain caught up with my eyes. The road was full of cows. Not one or two strays that had pushed through a fence, which happens, which is a Tuesday in this part of Texas, which is the kind of thing you deal with, move along, file a short report. I mean, the road was full of cows. Wall to wall. Both lanes and the shoulders on either side. Big Hereford cattle, the red and white kind, standing in that particular way cattle stand at night, which is extremely still and extremely unbothered, like they had always been there and the highway had been built around them and the inconvenience was entirely yours. I stopped my unit about 50 yards back and I turned on my overheads and I sat there for a moment watching 40 animals do absolutely nothing in my flashing lights. And then I saw the car. It was sitting in the middle of the herd, actually inside the herd, surrounded on all sides, a 1971 Cadillac DeVille white, the kind of car that in 1994 was already old enough to be either a classic or a mistake depending on who owned it. It was pristine. I mean, that car was clean in a way that suggested someone cared about it the way some men care about things they love, which is quietly and completely and with a lot of wax. Engine running, headlights on, and on the roof of that Cadillac, standing with the particular careful balance of a man who has recently had several drinks at a formal event but is not yet willing to admit it, was a person in a tuxedo. Not a rental tuxedo. I know the difference. This was a real tuxedo, the kind with the satin lapels that catch light differently than the rest of the jacket. He was holding his jacket in his right hand, and as I watched, he extended his arm to the side and gave it a slow wave, like a matador with significantly less urgency and significantly more dignity than the situation called for. One of the cows moved 3 steps to the left. I got out of my unit. Now, I have a process when I approach an unknown situation on a highway. It is methodical. It involves assessment of threat level, confirmation of scene safety, and a practiced professional demeanor that communicates to whoever I'm dealing with that I have seen everything and nothing surprises me. I walked up to that Cadillac, stopped at the front bumper with cattle on 3 sides of me, looked up at the man standing on the roof, and I said, "Sir." He looked down at me. He had silver hair combed back. He was probably 60 years old. He had the kind of face that, in a different context, you would describe as distinguished. In this context, you would describe it as serene in a way that was not entirely chemical but was at least partially chemical. He said, "Officer, good evening." I said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to come down from the roof of your vehicle." He said, "I understand that completely and I intend to do exactly that." He paused. He waved the jacket again. Another cow shifted. He said, "In just a moment." I stood there. He was I realized after about 30 seconds of watching, actually working, this was not random jacket waving. He had a system. He was reading which animals were blockers and which were movable, and he was creating a slow, patient corridor through the herd using nothing but a tuxedo jacket and what I can only describe as a deeply unhurried confidence. A cow on the left shoulder moved toward the fence line. 2 animals near the center stripe took a few steps north. The corridor was not wide, but it was forming. I looked around at the fence line running parallel to the highway. About 200 yards back there was a gap, a section of wire fence that had been pushed down, probably by the cattle themselves, probably over the course of an evening that had gotten away from whoever was supposed to be watching them. This was a working ranch situation, escapees, the kind of thing that happens when a gate latch isn't what it used to be or when cattle decide collectively that the grass on the other side of the fence is a matter worth investigating. I looked back at the man on the roof of the Cadillac. I made a decision. I went back to my unit, turned it around, and used it to block the southbound lane. Then I came back and I positioned myself on the east shoulder and I started doing what he was doing. Moving slowly, using my arms, creating pressure on the herd from the opposite side. I don't have a lot of formal cattle experience, but I grew up in this part of Texas and you absorb certain things by proximity, and the basic principle of moving a cow from point A to point B is not complicated if you have patience and if you don't make any sudden movements and if you accept that the cow's timeline and your timeline are not the same timeline and never will be. We worked like that for 45 minutes. He on the roof of the Cadillac with the tuxedo jacket. Me on the shoulder with my arms out like I was directing very large, very slow aircraft. Neither of us said a single word to each other for the entire 45 minutes. Not one word. There was something almost formal about it, like we had both independently recognized that the situation had its own protocol and that the protocol did not include conversation. The cattle moved. Slowly, then with more commitment, then all at once the way herds move when they've made a collective decision. They flowed off the highway and back through the gap in the fence like they'd been thinking about going back anyway and had just needed the right moment. The last cow crossed the fence line at approximately 1:55 in the morning. The man climbed down from the roof of his Cadillac. He was more agile than I expected. He put his jacket back on, smoothed his lapels, and looked at the now empty highway with the expression of someone reviewing completed work.
He walked over.
I said, "Sir, can I ask what you're doing out here at this hour?" He said, "I was driving home from my rehearsal dinner." I said, "Your rehearsal dinner?" He said, "My wedding is on Saturday." He said this with complete composure, like it explained everything, which in some way it did, and in some way it absolutely did not. I looked at him for a moment. I looked at the pristine white Cadillac with 2 faint boot-shaped marks on the roof that were going to require some attention before Saturday. I looked at the empty highway in both directions, silver in the moonlight, no cattle, no evidence that any of this had happened except for what the road surface might reveal in daylight. I asked him if he'd been drinking. He said, "A reasonable amount for a rehearsal dinner." I had him step through the standard field checks. He passed everything. Not by a wide margin on one of them, but he passed. Enough. The ranch that owned those cattle was a quarter-mile up the road. I could see the farmhouse lights, and I was going to need to knock on that door regardless. He was sober enough to drive the remaining 11 miles to his house, which he knew by heart, he said, because he'd been driving it for 40 years. I let him go. I watched those taillights disappear down US 83 into the dark and the moonlight, and I stood there on the shoulder of that highway for a moment before I got back in my unit, and I thought about how I was going to write this report. The report, for the record, says, livestock on roadway, assisted in clearing, no injuries, no property damage, coordinated with ranch owner regarding fence repair. Every word of that is accurate. None of it mentions the tuxedo. None of it mentions the 45 minutes of silent cattle choreography between a county deputy and a man standing on the roof of a 1971 white Cadillac DeVille on a full moon night on US 83, using a satin lapel jacket like he'd been doing it his whole life. I've told this story at every retirement party I've been to since 1994. It gets funnier every single time. Not because I add anything to it, I don't need to add anything to it. It's funny in the exact shape it already is. It's funny the way only true things can be funny, with that specific density that fiction never quite achieves, where the details are too particular and too useless to have been invented. A man in a tuxedo on the roof of a white Cadillac on a moonlit highway directing cattle with his jacket. I hope he had a good wedding. I genuinely hope that. I never did find out if he pulled it off on Saturday. The thing about being 19 and invincible is that the invincibility is completely invisible to you until the exact moment it isn't. I didn't plan to almost die on FM 170. Nobody plans that. Nobody packs for a trip and thinks, let me make sure I have everything I need for a medical emergency in one of the most remote stretches of road in the continental United States. A road that runs along the Rio Grande through Presidio County, where the nearest town is 40 miles in either direction and the cell service isn't spotty. It's non-existent. It simply does not exist. The way certain things simply do not exist in places that haven't decided yet whether they want to be part of the modern world. I've taken my shoes off to drive. That's the detail I'm most embarrassed about. Not that I ran out of gas, though I did, completely and totally, the needle sitting on E for the last 20 miles while I told myself the gauge was probably off, which is the kind of logic that only works when you're 19 and haven't been proven wrong enough times yet. Not that I had no water in the car. Not that my phone had shown no signal since before Presidio. The detail that gets me, the one my mother still brings up at Thanksgiving 20 years later with a specific expression on her face that communicates both love and exhaustion, is that I had taken my shoes off and put them in the back seat while I was driving because my feet were hot. So when my car rolled to a stop on the shoulder of FM 170 at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon in July, in a temperature that the weather station in Presidio later logged at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, I was barefoot. I sat in the car for a few minutes after it stopped, which was the right instinct even if I'd arrived at it accidentally. The car was still cooler than outside. I tried my phone in every corner of the interior, held it up to every window, climbed into the back seat and held it toward the rear glass, which someone had once told me improved signal reception and which I now know is completely invented folklore. Nothing. I looked at the road in both directions. FM 170 through that part of Presidio County is one of the loneliest roads in Texas, which means it's one of the loneliest roads anywhere. On your left, going east, the Rio Grande runs below the bluffs. Sometimes you can see it, a flat brown line of water that looks too small and too tired to be an international border. On your right, the Chihuahuan Desert goes until it doesn't, which is a long way. The road itself is narrow and perfect and completely, utterly empty in a way that in other circumstances would be beautiful. In those circumstances, it was not beautiful. It was just empty. I made the decision that I now understand, with the full benefit of 20 years of hindsight and one very memorable conversation with a search and rescue volunteer at a dinner party, was the wrong decision. I got out of the car and I started walking. The pavement was, I don't have a word for what that pavement was. Hot doesn't cover it. I've touched a pan that came out of a 400-degree oven, and the FM 170 asphalt at 2:30 in the afternoon in July was comparable. I made it maybe 30 feet before I stepped off the road and onto the rocky shoulder, which was better in the way that a moderate burn is better than a severe one. I started walking east because I thought I remembered passing something, a structure of some kind, a building or maybe a ranch gate, maybe a mile back. I had not passed anything a mile back. I had passed something closer to 4 miles back, and it was a cattle gate with no house attached to it. I walked for a long time. Here is what nobody tells you about heat exhaustion when you're 19. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic warning. What happens is much quieter and much more frightening. The world just starts getting slightly wrong around the edges. Colors shift a little. Your thoughts, which should be moving in straight lines, start taking gentle curves that you don't notice you're taking. I remember thinking very clearly and very calmly that I should try walking on the white line at the edge of the road because white reflects heat and would be cooler on my feet. This is not true. It's not even close to true. But it felt at the time like an insight. I don't know exactly how long I walked or how far. My best reconstruction later, using the mile marker where my car was found and the mile marker where the trooper found me, is that I walked approximately 4 miles. In the wrong direction. I had turned around at some point without realizing I turned around, which is one of the things heat does to your navigation, and I was heading west, away from anything, deeper into the part of FM 170 that doesn't want you. What I remember next is a vehicle. Not the sound of it first, that's what's strange. I saw the light off the windshield before I heard the engine. A flash of reflected sun that my confused brain processed as something significant, and I stopped walking and stood there on the shoulder and watched it come toward me. It seemed to take a very long time to arrive. Later I understood that this was because my perception of time had become unreliable, but standing there on that rocky shoulder with the Rio Grande somewhere below the bluffs to my left and the desert going forever to my right, that patrol unit coming down FM 170 felt like something being sent rather than something that happened to be passing. He pulled over and got out, and I remember his face doing something when he saw me, not alarm exactly, but a rapid quiet assessment, the kind of look that means someone is immediately calculating what they're dealing with and what needs to happen in what order. He asked me my name. He asked me if I knew where I was. He asked me when I'd last had water. I told him my name. I said I was on FM 170. I said I'd had a bottle of water that morning, which it now occurred to me had been approximately 6 hours ago. He put me in the front seat of the unit, not the back, the front, which I noticed even in that state because I understood the difference, and he turned the air conditioning to maximum and he reached behind the seat and produced a bottle of water and he said, "Drink this slowly," he said, "slowly, deliberately, don't rush it." I drank it slowly. He got on his radio and reported my car's location and arranged for it to be flagged. And then he sat in that idling patrol unit on the shoulder of FM 170 and he didn't pepper me with questions or lecture me or do anything except let the air conditioning do what air conditioning does while I came back to myself in gradual increments, like a picture developing. After a while, when my thoughts had returned to moving in straight lines, he reached into a bag on the back seat and produced a granola bar. The gas station kind, the ones in the crinkly wrapper with the nature scene on the front. Oats and honey, I think. He said he'd been saving it since that morning, which I understood to mean it was his, which I understood to mean he was giving me the thing he'd been saving for himself. I ate it. I don't know if you've ever eaten something in a moment where your body has been using everything it had and has run out of reserves and is now accepting help from the outside. But if you have, you know that ordinary food in that moment stops being ordinary. That granola bar, cheap, gas station, the kind that costs $1.19 and that under normal circumstances you eat without tasting. That granola bar was the best thing I had put in my mouth in 19 years of eating. I finished it and sat there with the wrapper in my hands and the air conditioning on my face and I started crying, which surprised both of us. He didn't say anything about the crying. He just handed me a second bottle of water from somewhere and looked out the windshield at the road. When I'd collected myself, I told him I was sorry. He said there was nothing to be sorry about. I told him I'd taken my shoes off. I don't know why I told him that specifically. Maybe because it was the detail that felt most like evidence of how wrong I'd gotten the whole situation. He looked down at my feet, which were dirty and slightly cut from the rocky shoulder, and he said, "We'll get you some socks from the kit in the back." He drove me to the car, confirmed it was mine and it was out of gas, called it in as a stranded motorist. He arranged for a fuel assist through a service out of Presidio. He waited with me until confirmation came through that someone was 40 minutes out, and then he asked me, before he left, if there was someone I wanted to call. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring the way mothers answer when something in them already knows. I told her where I was and what had happened, and she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Are you all right?" I said yes. I said a trooper found me. I said he gave me his granola bar. She started crying too, which made me cry again, and I sat on the hood of my broken-down car on FM 170 in 104-degree heat and cried on the phone with my mother while the trooper drove away down that narrow, perfect road and disappeared into the distance and the Rio Grande ran somewhere below the bluffs and the desert went on forever in the other direction. I think about that granola bar more than any reasonable person should think about a granola bar. I think about it when I'm careless, when I'm cavalier about water on a hike, when I let my gas gauge drift toward E on a long drive, when I make the 19-year-old calculation that everything will probably be fine because it has always been fine before and therefore will continue to be fine indefinitely. I think about what it means that a stranger on a lonely road gave me the thing he'd been saving for himself without making anything of it, without a speech, without a lesson attached, without any indication that it was anything other than the obvious next thing to do. I've tried to be that person in the years since. I don't always manage it, but I try, and I always keep snacks in the car. I always keep water in the car, and I have never, not once in 20 years of driving, taken my shoes off.
The data doesn't lie. That's the first thing they teach you in accident reconstruction. Not the witnesses. Witnesses are unreliable in ways that aren't their fault, ways that are simply human, the way memory compresses and expands and fills in gaps with whatever the brain decides is most logical. Not the physical evidence alone, because physical evidence needs interpretation and interpretation needs a framework. But the data, the electronic logging device, the event data recorder, the black box that sits in the cab of every modern commercial truck and records speed and braking and engine load and GPS coordinates with a timestamp precision measured in fractions of seconds, the data is just the data. It doesn't have a perspective. It doesn't get scared. It doesn't decide afterward that something happened differently than it happened. I've built my entire professional life on that principle. Which is why what I found on the black box of that Peterbilt on SH6 near Herne in November of 2016 has never fully left me, because the data didn't lie, and what the data said made no sense at all. I'd been with the department's Commercial Vehicle Enforcement and Accident Reconstruction Unit for 14 years by that point. I was not someone who spooked easily. I pulled the manifest data. The truck was contracted to a refrigerated freight company out of Dallas, hauling produce. In the 72 hours covered by that data, the truck had made one log delivery, one, at a distribution facility in Waco. One pickup, one delivery. A route that should have taken, at most, 8 hours including mandatory breaks. The GPS track for the other 5 passes on SH6 didn't connect to any origin point that made sense. The truck wasn't coming from the Dallas terminal. It wasn't coming from Waco. The track started, and this is the part that I ran 4 times and got the same result 4 times. The track started from a GPS coordinate that placed the origin point in a field. Not a truck stop, not a parking facility, not a rest area. A field off a county road in Robertson County about 3 miles from the highway. No structure at that coordinate. I checked satellite imagery from 3 different sources. Just a field. I contacted the freight company. Their dispatch records showed the truck on a single scheduled run, the Waco delivery, during that window. They had no record of any other dispatched routes. They had no explanation for the additional mileage on the ELD, which was significant. The odometer delta didn't match their records by several hundred miles. They said they'd look into it. They never followed up. I drove out to that field. I don't know exactly what I expected to find. I'm a data person. I don't do things based on feelings. I do things based on evidence and procedure and the need to have a complete picture. I drove out there on a gray Tuesday afternoon because there was a GPS coordinate in my data that didn't connect to anything, and my job was to connect things. The field was exactly a field. Flat, fallow, winter brown. A county road running along one edge of it, wide enough for a large vehicle to pull off and park. The ground was hard enough that week. We'd had a dry spell, that any tire impressions from days earlier would have been minimal. I walked the edge of the road along the field's perimeter and found nothing conclusive. Some disturbance in the bar ditch that could have been a large vehicle or could have been a tractor or could have been nothing. I went back to the data. The driver, once he was recovered enough to interview, about 2 weeks after the crash, said he remembered the Waco delivery. He remembered getting back in the truck. He had a partial memory of being on SH6 at some point and feeling disoriented, not knowing what time it was or why he was on that road. He did not remember 5 additional passes on that highway. He did not remember the field. His medical evaluation came back with findings consistent with a dissociative episode possibly related to an undiagnosed sleep disorder, a condition where a person can perform complex tasks, including driving, while in a state that is not fully conscious wakefulness. It's documented. It's real. It happens. The case was closed as a medical episode leading to loss of vehicle control. The freight company paid the driver's medical bills and quietly reassigned him to local runs. No criminal findings. No regulatory action beyond a mandatory medical review for commercial license renewal. I signed off on the report. I still signed off on the report. But here's what I didn't put in the report because it wasn't data, because it was the kind of thing that has no business in an official finding. Because I am a data person and data people don't include things they can't verify. On my 5th review of the GPS tracks, I ran them 5 times total over the course of the investigation. I noticed something I hadn't noticed in the first 4 reviews. The 6 passes on SH6 weren't random traversals of the corridor. They weren't the irregular pattern you'd expect from someone driving in a dissociative state, covering ground without purpose or direction. They were getting shorter. The first pass covered about 19 miles of SH6. The second covered 14. The third and fourth, 9 and 7 miles, respectively. The fifth, for miles. And the final pass, the one that ended in the ditch, covered 2 miles before the truck left the road. Each pass was a subset of the previous one, like something being narrowed. like a search pattern that was zeroing in on a specific point. The crash site was at the center of that narrowing. I've thought about the rational explanations. A GPS artifact, a data logging error that created false coordinate clustering, the dissociative episode creating a repetitive behavioral loop, the way sleepwalkers sometimes return to the same path. The human tendency to find patterns in random data, which is one of the most well-documented cognitive biases in existence and which I am professionally trained to guard against. I've run through all of it, and I'll be honest with you. I've been honest with you about everything else, so I'll be honest about this too. None of the rational explanations sit flat. Every single one of them has a corner sticking up. I kept a copy of that GPS data on a personal drive. Not the full case file, just the track overlay, the image that shows those 6 passes on SH6 getting shorter and shorter, converging on a point in the fog on a November morning, like whatever was happening was always going to end exactly there, at exactly that mile marker, at exactly 4:10 in the morning. I look at it sometimes. Not often. Not obsessively. Just occasionally when a case comes across my desk that's too clean, too easily categorized, too quick to close. I look at it as a reminder that the data doesn't lie, but that the data also doesn't always tell you what the lie is. Sometimes the numbers give you the shape of a question you don't have the framework to answer. And sometimes the most honest thing a data person can do is sit with that. Write the report. Sign the report. And keep the image on a personal drive in a folder with no label for the days when you need to remember that the road keeps certain things for itself.
My father never talked about the job at dinner. That was the rule in our house. Not a spoken rule, not something that was ever announced or written down or explained to me when I was old enough to understand what he did for a living. It was just a fact of the household, the same way certain rooms had certain temperatures and certain chairs belonged to certain people. The dinner table was where we talked about school and the ranch and whatever was happening in town and what needed fixing on the property. The job stayed in the car. My father would pull into the driveway in his unit, sit there for a few minutes. I used to watch him from my bedroom window sometimes, just sitting, not on the radio, not doing paperwork, just sitting. And then he'd come inside and hang up his hat and wash his hands and sit down and be my father instead of a trooper. I respected that about him even before I understood it. There was one story, though, that made it to the dinner table. It came out on Thanksgiving, the year I was 11, which would have been sometime in the early 90s. I don't remember what caused him to tell it. Someone asked something or something on the news triggered it, or maybe it was just one of those evenings where the food was good and the house was warm and something in him needed to say a thing out loud. He told us that earlier that year, on a night patrol on US 277 near Abilene, he had come across a station wagon that had rolled and caught fire in the median. He had pulled a family out of that car. A mother, a father, 2 children. He'd gotten all 4 of them out before the fire reached the fuel line. He told it plainly, the way he told everything. No drama, no heroics, just sequence. This happened, then this, then this. He said the father had a last name he recognized from around town. He said the 2 kids were young, maybe 5 and 7. He said the thing he remembered most was that when he got the last one out, the youngest child, the car went up behind him and the heat was so immediate and so total that it felt like a wall. And he stood there in the median of US 277 with this child in his arms and the heat on his back, and he thought very clearly, that's what close feels like. He never told it again. Not that I heard. But every Thanksgiving after that, at some point during the meal, someone would say, remember the story about the family? And he would nod, and that was enough. It was a once-a-year acknowledgement that the story existed, that it had happened, that it was part of who he was. I grew up and I went to the academy and I passed the exam on my first try, which I knew would matter to him even though he didn't say so, and I got assigned to a district in Central Texas and I started my career. And because of the way district assignments work, because of the particular geography of my posting, I ended up patrolling some of the same roads he had patrolled. Different decade, same asphalt. There was something about that I didn't quite have a word for. Not pressure exactly, not inadequacy. More like inheritance. Like the road already knew my last name. My first solo patrol night was in early spring of 2021. Clear and cool. The kind of Texas spring night that feels like an apology for the summer that's coming. I was running US 277 south of Abilene, which is a long flat corridor through ranch country that at night gives you the specific kind of solitude that either suits you or it doesn't, and I had figured out by then that it suited me the same way it had suited him. The call came in at 9:45 p.m. Stranded motorist US 277, approximate mile marker consistent with the stretch near where my father had worked that Thanksgiving story 30-something years earlier. I didn't register the mile marker consciously at the time. I was new, I was focused, I was running through my approach checklist the way you do when the training is still loud in your head. I pulled up behind a newer model pickup that was sitting on the right shoulder with its hazards going. The driver was already out, standing at the rear passenger tire, which was flat in the dramatic complete way that tires go flat when they hit something substantial at highway speed. He was a young man, maybe 17 or 18. He had the look of someone who knew roughly what needed to happen next but had never actually done it and wasn't sure where to start. I ran the plate while I was still in my unit. Standard. The name that came back on the registration stopped me. It was the same last name my father had said at that Thanksgiving table. The specific last name, not a common one, the kind of name that in a county this size means something, means a particular family on a particular piece of land that's been there for generations. I sat with that for a second. Then I got out. I introduced myself and asked if he was all right, and he said yes, ma'am, because I was a woman in a trooper's uniform and he was a teenager from ranch country and his parents had raised him right. And I asked him if he knew how to change the tire, and he said he thought so, but he'd never done it on this truck and wasn't sure where the spare was mounted. We found the spare together. I showed him the jack points on the frame and let him do the work while I held the flashlight, because there is a specific kind of learning that only happens when your hands are on the thing and someone experienced is standing close enough to correct you without taking over. He worked carefully and methodically and asked one good question about torque sequence on the lug nuts, which told me he was paying attention. While he was working, I asked him where he was headed. He said he was coming back from a friend's place outside of Abilene. I asked him who his people were. It's a natural question out here, the way you establish context, and he gave me the family name. I said, I think your family might know mine. He looked up from the tire. I told him my father's name. I watched him process it. He said, my dad talks about a trooper with that name. He said his dad had a story about a car accident when he was a kid, about a trooper who pulled his family out before the car burned. I had to take a breath. I said, that was my father. He sat back on his heels and looked at me in the way people look at each other when the geometry of a moment becomes too precise to be ordinary. The kind of look that says, I understand that something is happening here that neither of us has a category for. We didn't say anything for a moment. The hazard lights kept their rhythm. Somewhere out in the ranch land, something moved through the brush. A deer probably, or a coyote, or just the wind finding something to push against. Then he finished tightening the last lug nut, stood up and said, I should call my dad. I said, I need to call mine. I walked back to my unit and I sat in the driver's seat and I called my father on my personal cell. It was almost 10:30 at night and he answered on the third ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been doing what retired troopers do when they can't sleep, which I suspected involved the television and a cup of something warm and probably not much else. I told him where I was. I told him the mile marker. He was quiet. I told him who I'd just helped. He was quiet for longer. Then he said, the youngest one, the one I carried out. Boy or girl? I said I didn't know, I hadn't asked. He said it was a boy, maybe 5 years old. Had on a red shirt. I always remembered the red shirt. I looked out my windshield at the young man on the shoulder, who was loading the flat tire into the bed of his truck. And I thought about a 5-year-old in a red shirt being carried away from a burning car on a Thanksgiving night on the same road by my father's arms. I thought about the 30-something years between that moment and this one, and about how a highway holds things you can't see. Not ghosts, nothing like that, just the compressed weight of what has happened on it, all the moments that occurred and mattered and then became invisible the way moments do. I said, Dad, I'm on your road. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had something in it that I recognized but hadn't heard often, a particular quality that men of his generation and his profession produce rarely and briefly, in moments when something has moved them past the point where composure is entirely possible. He said, I know you are. I finished the call and got out of my unit and walked back to the young man, who had everything stowed and his truck ready to go. I told him to take it easy on the spare, keep it under 50, get the tire replaced in the morning. He shook my hand, actually shook my hand, which again, ranch country parents, and then he paused and said, should I tell my dad? I said yes. I said tell him the trooper's kid was on the same road. He nodded like he understood the weight of that, which I think he did. I watched him pull back onto US 277 and his taillights get small in the distance and disappear, and I stood on the shoulder of that highway for a long moment before I got back in my unit. The ranch land was dark and still around me. The road went north and south into the same darkness in both directions, the same road it had always been, carrying the same invisible weight it had always carried. I filed my first solo patrol report that night when I got back to the station. In the narrative section, I wrote, "Assisted stranded motorist with tire change. No injuries. Motorist sent on his way safely." Everything that actually happened. My father's voice on the phone, the red shirt, the burning car, the 30 years folded into a roadside tire change on a cool spring night. None of that goes in a report, but I've told it every Thanksgiving since. I have spent 50 years in classrooms telling young people that wonder is not a feeling. Wonder, I would tell them, is a practice. It is a discipline. It is something you do deliberately and repeatedly until it becomes the default orientation of your mind toward the world. The feeling comes and goes. The feeling is unreliable. The feeling depends on sleep and whether your coffee was good that morning. But the practice, if you build it carefully over years, becomes structural. It holds you up from the inside the way bones do. I taught philosophy for 41 years at a small university in Central Texas. I have read every major thinker who ever tried to articulate what it means to be alive and paying attention. I have assigned Aristotle on wonder, on thaumazion, the Greek word that means something between astonishment and inquiry, the thing Aristotle believed was the beginning of all philosophy. I have taught Simone while on attention, on the radical act of truly seeing what is in front of you. I have spent decades building a vocabulary for the experience of encountering something larger than yourself and being changed by it. And then in September of 1999, a young trooper on US 90 near Marfa spent 45 minutes explaining the night sky to me, and I understood for the first time that I had been teaching the map while he was living in the territory. My car broke down on a Friday night, which I know because I had driven out to Marfa specifically for the weekend. I went several times a year in those days, partly for the particular quality of the light and partly for the silence, which in Presidio County has a density and a texture that is genuinely different from silence elsewhere, and partly, if I'm honest, because the drive itself was part of what I needed. I was in my early 50s then, still sharp, still publishing, still believing that thinking carefully about things was the same as understanding them, which is a mistake that takes a long time to identify in yourself, and longer still to admit. The car. A dark green sedan I'd had for 11 years and trusted completely, and should not have trusted completely, simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with warning sounds or dashboard lights or any of the narrative courtesy that machines sometimes provide before they fail. It just stopped, coasted to the shoulder of US 90, and became a very expensive piece of stationary sculpture on one of the loneliest highways in the American Southwest. It was approximately midnight. I had perhaps a quarter tank of gas, which was irrelevant because the problem was not the gas. I had a flashlight that worked. I had a jacket in the back seat because I had driven this road enough times to know that the desert at night in September is not the desert of the afternoon. I had no cell phone because in 1999 the people who had cell phones were a specific subset of the population and I was not in it, and even if I had been, the cell coverage on US 90 west of Alpine in that era was theoretical at best. I got out and stood beside the car and looked at the road. I want to be precise about what the sky was doing that night because it matters to what comes next. There is a reason people drive to the Big Bend region specifically to look up. The darkness there is protected in a way that is increasingly rare, a darkness that has not yet been diluted by the accumulated light of human settlement. What you see on a clear September night on US 90 near Marfa is not the sky that most people in this country still have access to. It is something older and more complete. The Milky Way was directly overhead, not the faint suggestion of it that passes for the Milky Way closer to cities, but the actual structure of it, the arm of the galaxy rendered visible as a band of such density and texture that it looks almost physical, almost like something you could reach into. I stood beside my broken car and looked at it for a while. About 20 minutes after I stopped, headlights appeared from the east and slowed, and a state patrol unit pulled in behind me with its amber running lights on. He got out and walked up, and he was young. I want to say 23 or 24, though I was in my 50s by then, and everyone under 35 looked approximately the same age to me. He had the particular bearing of someone who had recently been given a uniform and a responsibility and was taking both seriously without being stiff about it. He asked if I was all right. I said yes, car trouble. He asked what it was doing, and I told him what I knew, which was that it had stopped, and he did a brief preliminary assessment under the hood with a flashlight and confirmed what I suspected, which was that whatever was wrong was not something either of us could fix on the shoulder of US 90 at midnight with what we had available. He called for a tow through his radio and was told the wait would be approximately 90 minutes, which out there was actually quite good. He asked if I wanted to wait in the unit, which was air-conditioned. I said I thought I'd rather stand outside, and I gestured upward in a way that I hoped communicated that I was referring to the sky and not making some philosophical statement about confinement. He looked up, and something changed in him, not dramatically, not in a way that was visible exactly, but perceptibly. The way a person's posture shifts when they move from the part of their mind where they're doing their job to the part where they simply are. He stood beside me and looked up for a moment, and then he said, "Do you know what you're looking at?" I said I knew the general principle. Galaxy, stars, light traveling improbable distances across improbable time. He said, "I mean specifically," and then he began. "I have sat in lectures by people who have spent their lives studying the sky. I have read the cosmologists and the astronomers and the mythographers who documented what every human culture across history made of the same darkness overhead. I have a reasonably sophisticated layperson's understanding of what the night sky is and how it works. What that young trooper did on the shoulder of US 90 for the next 45 minutes was different from any of that. He started with Scorpius, which was low on the southwestern horizon, and which he said was best seen from Texas in summer, but was still visible on September nights if you caught it before it set. He traced the shape of it with his finger against the sky the way a person traces something they have drawn themselves. He told me that in ancient Mesopotamia the scorpion was considered the guardian of the underworld, that it rose when the sun set and set when the sun rose, that for certain ancient cultures it was understood as the creature that held the boundary between day and night. He said this not as a recited fact, but as something he found genuinely interesting, the way people talk about things they have come back to many times. He moved to the Milky Way. He explained that we were looking at it edge-on, that the density of stars we were seeing was the compressed view down the plane of the galaxy, that the dark rifts running through it were not absences of stars but clouds of dust so thick they blocked the light behind them. He said those dark lanes had their own names in different cultures. The Inca called the dark spaces the dark constellations, he said, and saw animals in the darkness rather than in the light, which he found more interesting than the Greek approach and which he said he'd been thinking about since he first read it. I asked him where he'd read it. He named a specific book, a scholarly work on archaeoastronomy that I was familiar with, that I had assigned once in a course on the philosophy of science. Not a popular book. Not something you encounter casually. A book you find because you are looking for it. I looked at him. He was still looking at the sky. I asked him how he'd come across it, and he said he'd found it in a used bookstore in Alpine and had been working through it for the past few months, reading it in his unit during quiet stretches of the overnight shift. He said the Big Bend region was one of the best places in the country for this kind of reading because the subject matter was directly overhead and you could check the book against the actual sky, which he thought was the correct way to study anything. I didn't say anything for a moment. He moved to Sagittarius, which he said marked the direction of the galactic center. The actual center, the point around which everything we could see was rotating, the location of a supermassive black hole 4 million times the mass of our sun. He pointed to the specific patch of sky and said, "Everything is going around that point right now, including us, including this car, including this road." He said it the way you say something that still surprises you even after you've known it for a long time. The tow truck arrived at approximately 1:45 in the morning. I shook his hand before I got into the cab, and I thanked him, and I tried to say something about what the 45 minutes had been. Some articulation of what it meant to encounter real knowledge held by someone you hadn't expected to hold it. I am a person who has spent his life working with words, and I could not find the right ones. He said, "Safe travels," and went back to his unit. I never learned his name. I was not thinking about names. I was thinking about the dark constellations, about the Inca looking at the sky and finding the animals in the darkness instead of the light, about a young man reading archaeoastronomy in a patrol unit on an empty highway at 3 in the morning because the subject was directly overhead and you should check the book against the sky. I went back to my classroom that following Monday and I threw out the first 2 weeks of my introductory philosophy course. I rebuilt the opening unit around a single question that I had somehow, in 40 years of teaching, never made the actual center of the curriculum. The question was, when did you last look up? Not metaphorically, not as a philosophical exercise. Literally, when did you last go outside at night and look at the sky the way it deserves to be looked at, with your full attention, with some knowledge of what you're seeing, with enough silence around you to let it land? I taught that question for the remaining 12 years of my career. It was the best teaching I ever did. All of it borrowed from a trooper on US 90 whose name I never thought to ask, who was reading the right books in the dark and checking them against the sky. The mangoes smelled like something I didn't have a name for yet. That sounds like a strange way to begin, but it's the truest detail I have from that morning, and after 8 years of thinking about it, I've come to believe that the truest detail is always the right place to start. I was standing at the rear of a battered Ford pickup at a way station on I-35 south of Laredo at 6:45 in the morning. The sky doing that thing it does in October just after dawn, where the light is still low and golden and hasn't committed yet to the harshness it's going to become by noon. And I had just dropped the tailgate, and the smell that came out of that truck bed was something between flowers and honey and warm earth. Something alive in a way that cut straight through the diesel and the dust and the particular institutional smell of a way station that has processed 10,000 trucks and remembers all of them. 219 pounds of Atolfo mangoes. I weighed them myself. I had flagged the truck for a routine overweight check. The gross vehicle weight was reading high on the approach sensors, not dramatically, but enough to pull it. The truck itself was the kind of old that suggested a long working life rather than neglect. A Ford F-250 that had probably been a good truck in another decade and was now a truck that knew what it was for. Tamaulipas plates. The bed was loaded with wooden produce crates stacked and tied down with a care that told me whoever packed them had done it before and took it seriously. I approached the driver's window with my clipboard. He was already crying before I got there. Not loudly. Not the way people cry when they're afraid or trying to manipulate a situation. I've seen both of those enough times to know the difference. This was the other kind. The kind that is already happening when you arrive, the kind that has been happening for a while and that the person has made a kind of peace with, the way you make peace with weather. He was a man in his 50s, compact, with the hands of someone who worked with them every day, and he was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the way station building, and the tears were just running, quiet and steady, and he didn't wipe them. He didn't look at me when I came to the window. I asked for his documents. He reached into the glove box and produced them with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this many times: registration, proof of insurance, his own identification. Everything in order, everything where it should be. The registration showed a different name than his ID, which flagged for follow-up. I asked him in Spanish if the truck was his. He shook his head, said it belonged to his brother. I asked where his brother was. He looked at me for the first time then, and something in his face. Not the tears, I'd already seen those, but something behind them, something that had gone still in the way things go still after the worst has already happened. Told me before he said a word. He said his brother had died 6 days ago. He said it the way people say true things that they are still learning are true. Carefully, like the sentence is made of something fragile. I stood at that window for a moment. My training has protocols for most situations. There are procedures and checklists and escalation paths and documentation requirements that exist because a way station is a regulatory environment, and regulatory environments run on process. I know all of it. I have run all of it correctly and thoroughly for 8 years. I asked him if he spoke any English. He shook his head again. I went back to my station and pulled up the translation app on the department tablet and came back to the window and held it up and asked him to tell me, in his own words, why he was here. What came through the translation, piece by piece, was this. His brother had an orchard in Tamaulipas. Atolfo mangoes, the small yellow ones, the ones that are richer and less fibrous than the varieties most people in the United States know. The ones that, when they're perfectly ripe, taste like the platonic idea of what a mango is supposed to be. His brother had supplied a small Mexican grocery in San Antonio for 11 years. Every October, when the late harvest came in, his brother would load the truck himself and make the drive north. Across the border at Laredo, up I-35, 4 hours to San Antonio, unload, share a meal with the store owner who had been his customer for over a decade, drive home. His brother had died 6 days ago. Heart attack. Sudden, no warning, the way hearts sometimes decide without consulting anyone. The harvest was in. The crates were packed. The store owner in San Antonio was expecting the delivery. Had been expecting it for 11 years, every October without fail. And his brother, before he died, had told him once, not as a final instruction, not knowing it would matter, just in the way people say things about the work they love, that the delivery was a promise. That you didn't break a promise to someone who had trusted you for 11 years. So he had loaded the truck himself. He had driven his brother's route. He had crossed the border alone for the first time in his life because he had never needed to before, because his brother had always been the one who did this. He had gotten on I-35 in the gray pre-dawn with 219 pounds of his dead brother's mangoes, and he was going to San Antonio because his brother had said it was a promise and his brother was gone and someone had to keep it. I stood at that truck window in the early October light, and I held the tablet between us, and I read the translation, and I looked at this man who had been crying quietly since before I arrived, and I made a decision that I want to be precise about. It was not an impulsive decision. It was not a sentimental decision. It was a decision I made with full awareness of what I was doing and why, and I would make it again without hesitation. I went back inside and I looked up the overweight fine schedule for a commercial vehicle on an interstate in Webb County. Then I went to my bag and I took out my personal wallet. The fine was within what I had. Not comfortably within it, I want to be honest about that. It was the kind of amount that would require some adjustment to the week's budget, nothing dramatic but real. I paid it at the processing terminal under my own name, and I printed the clearance documentation, and I walked back out to that Ford pickup in the golden October morning light, and I handed the paperwork through the window. I told him through the tablet that the weight issue had been resolved and he was clear to proceed. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at me. I watched him understand what had happened, and I watched him decide how to respond to it, which took a moment because I think it was not something he had a ready category for. He said, through the tablet, I cannot accept this. I said, you're not accepting anything. Your brother made a promise. You're keeping it. That's not something that should get stopped at a way station. He read the translation. He looked at the windshield for a moment. Then he looked back at me and he said something that the tablet rendered as, my brother would have liked you. I didn't answer that. I'm not sure there was an answer to that. I told him the route to San Antonio, the specific exits, the streets he'd need once he was in the city. I wrote it on the back of the clearance form because I didn't trust the tablet for something that needed to be in his hands. Then I told him the last thing, which I had been thinking about since I read his story through the translation, which felt not like an official instruction but like the right thing to pass from one person to another on an October morning on the Texas side of a border crossing. I told him to eat one of the mangoes before he got back on the highway. He looked at me. I said, your brother grew them. You drove them 4 hours. Eat one before you go. I think your brother would want you to have one. He sat with that for a moment. Then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into the passenger seat and produced a mango already ripe, already that deep gold color, like he'd brought one up front with exactly this intention. Like some part of him had known before he left Tamaulipas that there needed to be one within reach. He held it up toward me through the window. I shook my head. I told him that one was his. He nodded. He started the truck. I watched that old Ford pull back onto the I-35 entrance ramp and find its speed and merge into the northbound flow of traffic and get small in the distance and disappear, and I stood in the way station lot in the morning light with the smell of those mangoes still in the air around me. That smell I hadn't had a name for when the tailgate came down. I have a name for it now. It's the smell of someone keeping a promise that was given to them by someone they lost. It's specific and it doesn't smell like anything else, and once you've encountered it you recognize it immediately, in all its forms, for the rest of your life. I checked my watch. It was 7:08 in the morning. I went back inside and poured a cup of the station coffee, which was terrible, and I stood at the window that faces the highway and I watched the trucks come through, and I thought about an orchard in Tamaulipas and a store owner in San Antonio who was going to open his back door that afternoon and find 11 years of trust still intact, still honored, still kept, delivered in a battered Ford by a man who had never made this drive before and was making it anyway because his brother had said it. Was a promise. I paid the fine out of my own pocket. I would do it again tomorrow. I would do it 100 times. I didn't tell anyone I was going alone. That wasn't stubbornness exactly, and it wasn't pride, though both of those things have been credibly alleged about me over the years by people who know me well enough to have standing. It was something quieter than either of those. It was the understanding, which had been building in me for several weeks before that final Saturday night in March, that the last patrol needed to be the same shape as the first one.
No ceremony.
No caravan of well-wishers in their personal vehicles following my unit down the highway like a funeral procession for something that wasn't dead yet. No radio chatter from colleagues wanting to mark the occasion with the kind of talk that turns a real thing into a performance of a real thing. Just the road. Just US 281 south of Abilene, the same corridor I had driven on my very first solo patrol night in the spring of 1991, 31 years earlier, when I was 24 years old and the uniform was still stiff in the shoulders, and I was so aware of the weight of the badge that I kept checking to make sure it hadn't shifted. I signed out of the station at 10:55 p.m. and nobody made anything of it because I hadn't told anyone what night it was. My retirement paperwork was filed and approved and sitting in a manila folder in the top drawer of my desk at home. Monday morning it would be submitted. Saturday night it was just paperwork, and I was just a trooper running a familiar road one last time, which is not something that requires an audience. The night was cool and clear in the way that late March sometimes delivers in Central Texas. A gift between the cold that is leaving and the heat that is coming. A few weeks of actual weather before the summer arrives and makes everything about endurance. The sky was open and the stars were doing what stars do on a clear night in ranch country where there's nothing tall enough or bright enough to argue with them. And I drove with the window down an inch the way I have driven every night patrol of my career because I learned early that the smell of the air tells you things the radio doesn't. I wasn't trying to feel anything in particular. That's the honest truth of it, and I want to say it plainly because there's a version of this story that wants to be more deliberate than it was, that wants me to have driven out there with a prepared interiority, with thoughts assembled in rows like a ceremony. I didn't. I drove out there because the road was the road and because 31 years needed to end somewhere and US 281 was the right somewhere, and whatever I felt while I was driving was going to be whatever it was going to be. What I felt, for most of the first hour, was simply the road. The quality of it. The way it opens up south of town into the long flat ranch corridor where the fences run close to the shoulder and the cattle are invisible in the dark but occasionally present at the fence line, their eyes catching the headlights for a moment and then gone. The way the radio traffic from dispatch creates a kind of background music that you stop hearing consciously after a few years but that your body still tracks, a low constant monitoring that happens below the level of thought. The way a patrol unit at night on an empty highway has its own particular atmosphere. Not lonely exactly, because loneliness requires expectation of company, and a highway patrol on a night shift doesn't expect company, it expects the road. It is a specific and acquired solitude that I had spent 31 years learning to inhabit and that I understood on that drive, going to miss in a way I didn't yet have the full measure of. I came around the long bend near Lampasas at approximately 11:40 p.m. There was a vehicle on the shoulder. An older model sedan, dark-colored, hazard lights going. Not broken down dramatically. No visible damage, no debris on the road. Just stopped, hazards blinking in the dark with that particular patient rhythm that says I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. I pulled in behind it and ran the plate. Registered to a man in his late 70s. Address in a small town about 30 miles south. I got out. He was already standing at the driver's side rear wheel when I walked up, and he turned at my approach with the unhurried manner of a person who is not surprised by much anymore. He was a big man, or had been, the kind of frame that carries age the way old timber carries, whether still solid at the core but with the evidence of years written into the surface. White hair, work-worn hands. He was wearing a flannel shirt and boots and the expression of a man who has had car trouble before and regards it as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. The tire was flat. Not a blowout. A slow leak that had finally given out, the tire sitting soft and wrong on the rim. I asked him if he had a spare. He said he did, but his jack had seen better days and he wasn't sure it would hold. He said this without complaint, as a simple report of conditions. I got my jack from the unit. We worked the tire change together the way men of a certain generation and background work alongside each other. Efficiently, without unnecessary conversation, each reading what the other needed without it being said. He handled the lug nuts himself, which told me his hands still worked, and I operated the jack, and we had the spare on inside 20 minutes. Good spare, properly inflated. He'd been maintaining the car the way people maintain things they depend on. When we straightened up, he looked at the work and nodded once, which I understood as satisfied. Then he looked at me. He said, "You been doing this long?" I said, 31 years. Starting tonight. He looked at me a moment. He had eyes that had been looking at West Texas for a long time and had developed the quality that long-looking produces. Not hard, not distant, but settled. Certain of what they were seeing in a way that younger eyes aren't. He said, "Starting or ending?" I said, "Ending. Tonight's the last one." He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected, though I couldn't have said what. He asked me where I was from originally, and I told him the town, the small one west of Abilene, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, just a slight reorientation, the way a person's face moves when something clicks. He said, "I grew up 20 miles from there." Named a specific road, a specific community that barely qualified as a community, just a name on a rural route that meant a cluster of families who had been there for generations. I knew the road. I had driven it as a boy with my father. We stood on the shoulder of US 281 near Lampasas at approximately 10 minutes past midnight, and we talked. Not in the careful way that strangers talk, feeling for common ground, in the easy way that people talk when they discover they're from the same small piece of the world, when the map in their heads turns out to have the same roads on it. He knew families I knew. He had worked land adjacent to land my grandfather had worked. He remembered a hardware store in town that had closed in the 80s that I also remembered, that had a specific smell of oil and sawdust that neither of us had thought about in years, and that both of us could still access completely, instantly, the way certain sensory memories survive everything. We talked for almost 2 hours. I want to be clear about that because it sounds unlikely. 2 hours on the shoulder of a highway at midnight between a trooper on his retirement night and an old man with a flat tire. But the time did what time does in certain conversations, which is disappear. The night was cool and still, and the stars were out, and there was no traffic on that road to speak of, and we leaned against the bed of his car and talked about the part of Texas we were from, and the way it had changed and the way it hadn't, and what it meant to spend your working life in a place and know it the way you know something you have paid sustained attention to for a long time. At some point, I think it was close to 2 in the morning, he said he should probably get back on the road. I straightened up and said yes, the spare would get him home, take it easy on it, get the tire looked at in the morning. He nodded. He opened his car door. Then he stopped with his hand on the door frame, and he turned back and he looked at me in that settled, certain way he had, and he said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. He said, "Son, it's a good road." Just that. Not as a pleasantry, not as small talk, as a verdict, as something he had weighed and considered and arrived at, and was now delivering with the full authority of a man who had been alive long enough for his assessments to mean something. It's a good road. I stood on the shoulder of US 281 and watched his taillights move south and get small and disappear, and I stayed there for a while after they were gone, just standing in the cool March night with the stars overhead and the ranch land dark and still on both sides and the road going north and south into the same darkness in both directions. I didn't need a ceremony after that. I didn't need a speech or a party or a room full of people saying the things people say at retirements. I had been given, on the shoulder of the same highway where my career began, by a man whose name I knew but whose path I had never crossed in 31 years of patrolling the same part of Texas, the only retirement speech that was ever going to be the right size for what the job had been. It's a good road. I drove back to the station. I signed in. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside, the way I always do, the way I have always done at the end of a shift since my first night in 1991. Just sitting, not on the radio, not doing paperwork. Just sitting. Then I went inside and hung up my hat. These were the roads. These were the people. These were the moments that don't make it into any report, but that troopers carry with them long after the badge comes off. In their wallets, in their chests, in the particular way they slow down at certain mile markers without knowing exactly why. If these stories stayed with you the way they stayed with the people who lived them, you're in the right place. This is Black Fears, where the road gives up its secrets 1 mile at a time. Subscribe, because the next story is already waiting just past the next bend in the dark.